This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live.
Today we are picking up on my talk from last Monday about cultural capital. We are having a think about exactly what it means. We're having a dive into the history of cultural capital, and we're thinking about ways that we can improve our teaching by including it deliberately into our practice.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live. Tune in live at ttradio.org, or to join in the conversation, download the Podbean app and search Teachers Talk Radio. Follow the hashtag TTRadio. Tune in, talk it out with Teachers Talk Radio.
A very good morning to you on this Saturday, the 1st of July 2023. We made it. We made it through the first 6 months of the year. We are now coming into my favourite part. As I said before, and as I said on the show, kind of last summer, I do like the second half of the year much more than the first. I like the summer holidays, of course. I think we all like the summer holidays. Even though summer is not my favourite season, I do like having a nice chunk of time off. And then I like that slide where we have all of the different celebrations. I've talked before on the show many, many times about how I like celebrations and how we kind of don't have too many in this first half of the year. But we're coming out to the part now where we have summer holidays, then back to school, and then half term, in which there is Halloween, I think, this year. There's definitely Halloween. I mean, I think it's in half term. And then, of course, into Christmas and New Year. So we've got all of the fun things coming up. And I really do like this half of the year. I really do. I'm kind of in a reminiscent mood, I suppose, today, because my academic year is coming to a close. My school actually finishes next Saturday the 8th, thankfully. We are finishing earlier than most state schools. I think 2-3 weeks earlier. This is the benefit of working in a school where we have longer lesson times in terms of the day, and where we work on Saturdays, because it means, of course, that all of that gained time is used to give us a couple of extra weeks in the summer, which is very, very welcome. So I've been thinking back on how the academic year 2022-2023 has gone. I don't know about for everybody else, but to me, this year has seemed like fluff, I think is what I'm going to say. Kind of like, marshmallow fluff. Either for my people in the UK, when you bite into a marshmallow and it's kind of like airy and sticky on the inside, and it's something and nothing. And then, of course, my friends across the pond in the USA, where you can buy marshmallow fluff in a jar and pop it in a sandwich, pop it on toast, and it's the same thing. It's airy, it's light, it's fluffy, it's something and nothing. And I feel like for me, that's how this academic year has been. There have been a lot of changes in my professional life this year that I have been so grateful for. I was thinking the other day, it's been about a year since I did my first in-person presentation, where I spoke at the MFL Icons meeting up in Manchester. And that was where I met Tom. And it was through doing that I was offered the chance to be here on Saturday morning breakfast with you all. And through Saturday morning breakfast, I've had the opportunity to talk to lots of interesting people, to connect, to network with lots of interesting people on Twitter, and to have more opportunities come via that. And so I'm very, very grateful. I'm very grateful looking back on the year that I've had the opportunity to meet all of these people, that I've had the opportunity to have this platform that I have. All because I took a chance and applied, to an advert to talk at a conference that I really didn't feel I had any business talking at. I'm not an icon. I'm just a teacher in a city that is nowhere near me. I'm down in the southwest, and of course Manchester is up north to the extent where one of my table mates at the event, we had the best table, by the way. I know that we had this debate not long after it happened, but my table was absolutely the best. But one of my table mates said to me, "Do they not have any of these down where you are?" Because I was so far away from home. It was such a random place for me to be. But I was accepted and I did my talk, and a lot came off of the back of that. And I think because of that, I've become a lot braver in terms of things that I am applying to do, things that I am deciding I want, things that I am putting out there into the universe to see whether they come to me. So the big lesson that I have learned this year, and hopefully the lesson that I'm trying to get across to all of you, is apply for these things. Apply to speak at Teach Meets. Apply for the SLT position that you want. Apply for the doctoral program. I didn't mention my doctoral program, but I'm very excited that I was given a place at Reading, and I'm on the first year of my Ed.D. Apply for all of these things, because the very worst that can happen is that you don't get accepted, and so you are in a place that is no different to where you are right now. And the very best thing that can happen is unimaginable, because these things snowball. It's like dominoes. One thing happens, then another, then another, then another. Either because of the connections that you make or the confidence that you gain from being accepted into these things. So do apply. It is worth applying for things that you may think you are absolutely not cut out for, because good things can happen and you can always say no. If you go through the application process and you get accepted and you realize that you really are not ready, you can turn the thing down because there will have been other applicants. But it is worth, in my opinion, it is worth taking those 15, 20 minutes, however long it might be, to apply for the thing so that you can do it. So that's been the kind of positive change in my life over this academic year. I don't think there have really been any negative changes. I think I'm very grateful for that. My family and friends have all made it through the year unscathed. We're all alive. My school is still standing. My children are still my children, by which I mean, of course, my children at school. My year 11s have come through their GCSEs. My year 13s have come through their A levels. It's been a year, I think, where school has thankfully been steady. School itself has been normal, what I would have expected. And that has allowed me to pursue all of these other things outside of school, all of this professional career development outside of school, for which I am very grateful. So yeah, fluffy. Fluffy is how I'm going with the year. It's been light, it's been airy, it's been something and nothing, but it's been nice. I've enjoyed it. And here is hoping that I haven't spoken too soon, because I am well aware that I've still got 6 days left. But here is hoping that the academic year 2023-2024 will be just as fluffy, because I think with the state of education at the moment, with all of the negativity surrounding talks of pay rises and disputes and strikes and funding cuts, and that's in addition to the cost of living crisis and fuel crises and whatever other crisis we happen to be living through. I think it's nice for us to hope for a little bit of fluff. I think it's nice for us to just try and enjoy some things, just try and enjoy where we are and what we are going through.
It's time for a fresh start to language learning. Pearson edXL's new student-centred French, German and Spanish 2024 GCSEs cater to the needs of all learners, regardless of their background, ability or reason for studying. Rooted in learned language knowledge, their assessments are transparent and accessible, allowing all students to showcase their language skills. Through inclusive and relatable content, the new Pearson edXL MFL GCSEs build a shared cultural capital that helps students develop an understanding of and appreciation for the wider world. Find out more at go.pearson.com/MFL GCSE 24.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
The BBC reported on the high cost of school uniforms. Whilst this is nothing new, the current cost of living crisis has brought the issue back into focus. The charity, the Children's Society, claims in the report that parents are spending an average of £422 a year on secondary and £287 on primary uniforms. This is despite rules that were meant to lower the cost. The government commented that it was working to ensure uniform costs are reasonable. The BBC reports that some parents have said that they are having to choose between uniforms and holidays because prices have increased. The Children's Society said it had polled 2,000 parents across the UK and found that parents could be paying an average of £75 for coats and bags, an average of £63 for sports clothing, and around £62 for school shoes. Under changes to the Education Act last year, schools in England are meant to be helping cut costs for parents. However, the Children's Society found pupils were still expected to have 3 to 5 branded items as part of uniform. Whilst many schools now offer pre-loved uniform to struggling families, parents and charities continue to say that more must be done. FE Week reports on the new NHS workforce plan, calling it a fantastic opportunity for the FE sector. In an opinion piece by Robert Halfon, the plan is claimed to put apprenticeships and skills training at the heart of the NHS workforce strategy. The FE sector already offers training for apprenticeships in a range of core healthcare roles, such as dental nurse, healthcare support worker and pharmacy technician. But the new plan seeks to broaden the range and routes into working for the NHS. The government has announced £40 million of funding over the next 2 years to help eligible providers expand degree apprenticeships. £48 million of funding is also backing the higher technical qualification in healthcare roles. The BBC features concerns about the number of nurseries closing in England, after more than 400 closed in the last year. The sector is blaming chronic underfunding and rising costs. The National Day Nurseries Association said the data raised serious questions about whether there would be enough places to deliver the government's promised expansion of free childcare. In the year to the end of March, the number of nurseries fell from 27,291 to 26,884, with the overall number of places dropping by 3,512. When childminders were included, the overall number of childcare places fell by 24,521. In March's budget, the Chancellor announced the extension of the current scheme, offering some families in England 33 hours of childcare per week for 3 to 4-year-olds to cover younger children. The change would be phased in from April next year. Nurseries say the amount of government payment does not cover costs, leading to closures for some businesses. A Department of Education spokesperson said that the picture was broadly positive, as the decrease in places was only 2% on last year, although it was recognised that there are some local challenges. This has been your Teachers Talk Radio News with Jo Fox.
This is 2 Minute Tech with Steve Woods, your tech briefing on Teachers Talk Radio.
Hello, this week I'm going to talk VPN. For those of you thinking, why is Steve talking about an underwear fashion faux pas? A VPN is a virtual private network, and knowing a little bit about them might make you realise you actually need one. What is it? Well, in a nutshell, a VPN changes how internet data is transmitted from a device. It allows the user to be more hidden. I know what you're thinking. I'm no cyber criminal. Why do I want to conceal my data? Well, let's look at 3 things a VPN can do for you. To any device you can put on the internet. Do you use public networks? A public network may be the Wi-Fi on the bus or train, a local coffee shop or fast food restaurant, any connection that isn't your home. Transmitting data on these networks can potentially allow your data to be intercepted by third parties. Having a VPN allows you to encrypt your data from your device rather than depending on the network you're connecting to. So, when surfing the web while enjoying a burger and fries, you can be confident if you're being intercepted, the data will be useless to the interceptor. The next is shopping online. When connecting to an online shop, some stores use your location and unique device ID to target you. If you're returning to look at a product, the likelihood is you're going to buy it. Knowing this, some stores use clever algorithms to increase the price to maximize their profit. With a VPN, you can mask this data so the price you see is the initial price. The third is some streaming services are blocked by internet providers or unavailable from outside of certain countries. If you're using a VPN, you can choose where to set your location to allow you to see the content you wish to stream. I've not looked at individual providers. Some are free, some are paid for. If you're unsure, find a friend who's using one, ask them about it, and use the same one as them to begin with. Then you get free tech support. Make sure you know the terms of service. You don't want the VPN you're using keeping your data, as that would defeat the object in the first place. As always, don't forget to check out the TT Radio Twitter feed. Tell us what you want to know about tech. I'm Steve Woods, and that was 2 Minute Tech.
2 Minute Tech with Steve Woods, your tech briefing on Teachers Talk Radio.
I think it's really good for all of us to be clued in on VPNs because our children use them, our students are using them. I'm fairly sure that if you have a policy in your school that allows students to bring their own devices, be it their phones, their tablets, whatever it might be, they will have a VPN installed so that if they connect to the school's Wi-Fi, they are able to circumnavigate a lot of the blocks that we have in place for safeguarding. I know this, my students have told me that they have a VPN. My students quite openly tell me that they use them. And I don't know, because I'm not techie enough to know, what we can do about it to keep our children safe. Because, of course, the reason that our own school networks have these blocks, these systems in place, is to protect our children, to safeguard our children. And so if they are using a VPN so that they can access their games at break time, so that they can watch Netflix when that's blocked on the network, whatever it might be, we have less control over what they are doing on the internet during school hours, and we have fewer opportunities. It's good for us to be clued up on VPNs. I think it's good for us to recognize that children know about them, that they are using them, and that putting, I will not use a VPN into your acceptable user policy doesn't stop the children from doing it, because they don't always kind of process and they don't always understand what the acceptable user policy is, what it's for, why they're agreeing to it. So, yeah, I think in addition to all of the benefits that a VPN can bring, I must say I have one on my home computer for when I'm shopping and stuff, specifically so that I don't get my prices jacked up, because I'd heard about that. I didn't know if it was true, but I had heard, so I'm glad that Steve has confirmed it there. But I don't think about doing it on my phone. And I will quite happily connect to the Wi-Fi when I'm on the train or when I'm sitting in a cafe. So I think ahead of going on holiday next week, where I'm sure I will connect to the airport Wi-Fi and then the plane Wi-Fi, if I am lucky enough to have Wi-Fi on my plane. I haven't actually checked yet. I should probably go ahead and install one on my phone just to protect my own data. And I think it is a shame. I think it's a shame that we need to go through these measures in order to keep ourselves safe online when being online is such a big part of our lives. But then I suppose the reality is that we have to, and the reality is that my front door is locked right now. So I am keeping myself and my possessions safe in the physical world. So I should probably do the same in the digital world as well. It's funny, isn't it, how we live these two types of lives, online and in reality. And we are, generally speaking, much more conscious of our safety in the online space. Sorry, no, we're not. In the offline space than we are in the online space. Let's talk about cultural capital, shall we? That's why we are here today. I was lucky enough to be joined by four amazing people on Monday night, two representatives from Pearson, two currently practicing teachers, and then me. And we had an amazing 2 hour conversation that just flew by, it disappeared, all about cultural capital. If you haven't listened back to that show, it's a show that was sponsored by Pearson. Please do go back and listen to that if you are interested in cultural capital, or if you have your interest piqued by anything that we talk about today, because I think this is a very, very important topic for all teachers to discuss, not just MFL teachers. On Monday, we were talking about cultural capital in terms of language, but cultural capital actually is very important across the school in all subjects. And even for those of you who are not teachers, because I know that I am very lucky to have a few members of my breakfast family who listen because they enjoy the show. They have other jobs relating to working with young people, social work, writing, that sort of thing. And I'm very grateful to have you here, very grateful. But it's good for you guys to consider cultural capital as well, because everything that we do with young people involves cultural capital. It involves culture. It involves making judgments about culture, whether they are explicit or implicit. And for me, it's really important for us to be aware of that, to be conscious of that, to be thinking about it. So yeah, please do go back and listen to that show if you haven't already, because there are some amazing insights from Katie, from Fiona, from Adam, from Olga. We had a great discussion. I still go back through and my notebook through the notes that I took from what they were saying, because there were some amazing things. I put up a display in my department on Thursday, all about cultural capital. This has really been on my mind this week, and so I kind of wanted to dive into it a little bit more here, to kind of pull out some threads that I thought were most interesting, and then to see how kind of over the summer we can think about culture, and how in September we can really begin to embed it into our own curricula. So we're going to start by going back to the 1930s, because that's really where this whole discussion of cultural capital begins. And I want you to think about George Orwell for a second. I want you to think about George Orwell's writing. George Orwell wrote some amazing things. I love George Orwell. I really do. 1984 was a book that I read, I think, when I was in year 10. It might have been in year 9. And it was the first time that I really felt like I was reading a grown-up book. I'd read Animal Farm already. I read Animal Farm, I think, when I was in year 8, so when I was about 12, 13. And I think Animal Farm, for all of its meaty, forgive that awful pun, for all of its meaty content, Animal Farm is very much a children's book, a young adult's book. Whereas when I was reading 1984, prompted by my English teacher, she gave me a copy to read outside of lessons. I really felt like I was reading a grown-up book for the first time, and it was gritty, but not in the kind of really depressing sense that that I get from gritty stuff these days. It realistic in quite a scary way, and it kind of really opened my eyes to the fact that there were so many different types of experiences outside of my own. Um, as a kid, and to be honest, as an adult, I was and am a science fiction fantasy person. I am looking right now at my bookshelves, and I've got a whole shelf dedicated to comic books and graphic novels and manga. I have got so much young adult fiction up here, which is invariably all variations on chosen one themes, because I really like the chosen one trope. Um, that's very much what I like is science fiction, fantasy, things that take me out of this world. Um, and so I was kind of reading something for the first time that was firmly grounded in our world, despite the fact that it was set, the year before I was born, and clearly hadn't come true. There were these elements of realism in it. I suppose it was science fiction realism in the same way that we have magical realism, that I could kind of believe. And a big point of 1984, just like Animal Farm, is that class divide, is the divide between high class and low class, between rich and poor. And this would have been a direct result of George Orwell's experiences. Because, of course, in the 1930s, we were going through the Great Depression. Now, in the cultural zeitgeist, the Great Depression tends to make people think of the US, because a lot of what we see about the Depression is about what was happening in America. It was about prohibition in the 20s. It was about stock market crashes and all that sort of thing. But Europe was going through a depression as well. Britain was going through a depression as well. Unemployment hit 2 million during this time. There are videos from Pathé which show men and women queuing in the streets in order to try and get work. And there is this very, very stark, very clear, very strict rich-poor divide. And it's here that cultural capital really starts. It's here that cultural capital is very important. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that class divides in Great Britain started in the 1930s, because we all know that's nonsense. We've all seen Downton Abbey. We all know that the rich had servants. We all know that there was the upstairs downstairs divide. And we all know that dates back, it goes back through Victorians, it goes back through Middle Ages when there's serfdom and literal landlords, the lords who owned the land that you live on. We know it goes back through the Iron Age, when we had tribes and there were chieftains and there were kings and there were queens and they were served by the people in their kingdoms. We know that for as long as there have been people, there has been a separation, a divide between those who have and those who have not. And it tends to be those who have not who serve those who have. But it's really in the 1930s that in Britain, in my opinion, this becomes very stark and very clear, and it becomes a problem. It becomes a cultural problem. It becomes something that actually starts interfering with the way that people live their lives, because it was at this point that Britain started pretending that it doesn't have a class system anymore. So as the servants moved out of the big houses, because actually they could be paid more working in factories, working in mines, than they could by working in the houses, there started to become this concept of social equality. So because people were no longer serving families and they were now serving a boss, there was less of a feeling of inferiority, because you no longer had somebody directly above you, literally lording it over you. You were earning your own wage, yes, for somebody else to increase somebody else's capital, but you were earning your own wage, which in turn allowed you to buy things that you wanted. So you could have your house, you could have your little garden, you could get flowers, you could get a television when that started to become more mainstream. We all know the boom in televisions around the coronation of the late Queen Elizabeth II. And so people started to become more individual. I think that this is where, particularly in British culture, the idea of Western individualism really started to become prominent. Because for the first time you could be. Because the people who had to work, the literal working class people, they now had more income, they now had more time. And yes, they were exhausted when they got home from working in the mine, but they got home and they could stop. It wasn't like being in service where you were working from the moment you woke up until the moment you went to bed. So there was now the advent of leisure time. There was the invention of the weekend. And there were strikes and political discussions that meant that you could have 2 days off, Saturday and Sunday. It wasn't just Sunday, the holy day, anymore. You could have the day before as well to enjoy yourself, to rest. But as people became more socially mobile, I suppose, they wanted more. They felt that they should have more. They aspired to more. And of course, quite often that more was kept from them because of their circumstances, because of job losses, because of unemployment being at 2 million. And so the difference between the rich and poor became very, very obvious at this point, because socially, theoretically, these people were the same. The owner of the mine socially would have been the same as the workers of the mine, not necessarily a lord or a lady, but just somebody who could have afforded to buy the mine in the first place. But they had the money, they had the capital, and the workers didn't. And so this divide, in my opinion, again, this is all just my opinion, became more obvious at this point. And so this is kind of where the class divide in Britain, again, became even more obvious. I'm about to use an oxymoron here. It became even more obvious, but in a very subtle way. Because you had fewer of your lords and ladies juxtaposed with their servants. And what was happening was you had these very subtle differences between people. You had these very subtle differences between the working class and the middle class. And you had working class people who were aspiring to be middle class. Raymond Briggs, in the biography he wrote of his parents, shows that juxtaposition between working and middle class beautifully. because he has his mum, who was in service before she got married, aspiring to be middle class. And he has his dad, who was very, very proud of being working class. And all of their kind of tension in their marriage. And he doesn't depict it as a tense marriage at all. It's clearly very loving, very supportive. But the little spats that they have, the little arguments that are depicted, are all about that difference in class. They're all about Raymond's dad, Ernest, happily swearing, happily supporting the Labour Party, going down the pub with his mates, all of those things that were very typical working class, while his mum, who had those aspirations of higher class, she didn't like swearing. She chastised him for swearing, particularly in front of a young Raymond. She didn't like to refer to them as common. She was quite happy to say that their neighbours were common, but she didn't want their family to be considered common. She was a supporter of the Conservative Party, always had been. And so the kind of political tensions in the family are quite obvious there. And this was in around this same time, the 1930s. And so what we have is this class tension in Britain, because the class boundaries have become a lot more woolly, a lot more wishy-washy. And this is one of the issues that we still have now when we define and categorize and talk about social class. There's a lack of agreement on what social class is, and there are all sorts of classification systems that exist. Because what I talk about as being working class versus middle class versus upper class, and then of course I'm saying working class, I'm saying middle class, but you can have lower middle class and upper middle class. That's going to be very different, I imagine, to what you think. Because I'm a teacher, obviously, that's why I'm here on Teachers Talk Radio. Teaching is traditionally a very middle class occupation, because to be a teacher, you have to have gone through university. You have had to have had these kind of middle class privileges. Yet I don't know if I would consider myself to be middle class because I work for a living, which is not to say that middle class people don't work, but I think it's odd to say that there is a working class and then there is a middle class, and people who work are not all in the working class. As a teacher, I don't earn a great wage. It's absolutely fine. I earn more than my parents do, but for the amount of work that we do, we know that teaching is not a good wage. For the amount of education that we have, the amount of experience that we have, we know that comparatively it's not as good as our uni friends who went into computing at the same time that we went into teaching, or who went into medicine as doctors, for example. And so while I probably, according to society's definition, I probably can't be considered working class because I have a white collar job, I'm not sure that I'm middle class either. And so I don't know where I fit in. I come from a working class family. And so I think I consider myself to be working class. I was the first person in my family to go to university. And all of that sort of thing. But the way that I'm describing it now, I'm sure that many of you are sitting there going, no, Darren, don't be stupid. You are clearly middle class because you're a teacher. And because that's how you personally define the class system. Or, no, don't be stupid, Darren, you are clearly working class because you only earn around £30,000 a year. Because that's how you define the class system. So because there is this lack of agreement on what the class system is, and because there are so many different types of class system, and because particularly in Britain, we do try and pretend that the class system doesn't exist anymore, it can be difficult to figure out exactly what we mean when we talk about the impact of class on education. And this fits perfectly into what we're talking about when we talk about cultural capital. I'm going to come back to what is next on my little slide in a minute, and I'm going to talk about what cultural capital actually is. Now, Tom, who I see is in our audience this morning, good morning to you. Tom actually asked me this question at the top of the show on Monday. So again, if you want to hear my very quick, very improvised answer to the question, what is cultural capital, please do go back and listen to Monday evening's show. And even if you don't want to hear my definition of cultural capital and you want to hear from other people, still do go back and listen to it, because it is a very fascinating show. But in a nutshell, this idea of cultural capital, it was set out in the 1970s by Pierre Bourdieu, who is a sociologist. And there was already this idea of economic capital. So those are the material advantages that people have across society, particularly the middle and upper classes. Pierre said, okay, yeah, that's true. You know, there are these economic advantages that people have. There are material advantages that people have. But actually, there are also cultural advantages that people have that contribute to educational inequality. So Pierre said basically that there are some children who are at an advantage at school because they had more knowledge and experience from their time at home than others. And in a nutshell, that's what cultural capital is. When I explained cultural capital to my year 9 French class on Wednesday, that's kind of what I told them it was. It boils down to what you know and what your experiences are. Because if we are social constructivist teachers, as I was trained to be, and I have done a whole show on social constructivism, so please do go back through the archives and listen to that one if you are not too sure about the term. We know that knowledge is built on pre-existing knowledge. And even if you're not a social constructivist teacher, even if you ascribe to another pedagogical theory, you will know that there are hooks that we try and hang new knowledge off of. There are links that we try and make to make knowledge easier for our children to retain. So it does kind of stand to reason that the more you know, the easier it is to learn something else. And again, from a linguistics point of view, from a language point of view, I say this to my kids all the time. I had an A-level in German when I went and did my stint in the Netherlands. I went to the Netherlands specifically because I have an A-level in German. That's a whole story. But because I had a grounding in German, I did find Dutch quite easy to pick up. Dutch is, by the way, the easiest language for a native English speaker to learn because of the shared cultural history there, the shared linguistic history. So I'm not saying that this is a massive achievement for me to have learned Dutch, but because I had German and I could make these links between sounds and between vocabulary, I find it much easier. Because I had some Swedish, I find it much easier because there are links there. Because I speak French and Latin fluently, I understand Spanish, particularly when I see it written, occasionally when I hear it, but particularly when I see it written, despite having never studied Spanish before, because of the links that I have, because of the knowledge that I can pull in. And so that works in my daily life all of the time. I told my year 9s that one of the Chinese euphemisms for members of the LGBTQ plus community is rabbit. And on the surface, that doesn't seem to make very much sense, and that can be quite difficult to remember. But if you go back and you look at how the Chinese god of same-sex relationships, because ancient Chinese religion had two gods of love and marriage and relationships, one that governed heterosexual and one that governed homosexual. The god of homosexual relationships was a rabbit god. And so that's where that came from. And having that knowledge helps me to remember this term that I wouldn't necessarily find easy to retain otherwise. So the more you know, and the more diverse your experience is, the easier it is to learn something else. This is also why, and I'm not going to get on my soapbox about this, but maybe that will be a show in August. This is also why I don't like the lauding of specialization in British education, because I think that we forget that a generalist's knowledge can be just as deep as a specialist's knowledge. And because as generalists we have a broad range of understanding, because we have a broad range of knowledge, we can more easily make links between different things. And it's these links between different things that helps to create knowledge, that helps to push knowledge forward. So this is what cultural capital is. It's having knowledge there in the background that helps you to learn the new stuff that you're being taught. And this is why it's capital, because you can have different amounts of knowledge. Our children come into the classroom with different amounts of knowledge, different experiences. And the cultural capital chasm that we were talking about on Monday, that's about that gap between the different experiences and the different knowledges that our children have that can disadvantage certain children and advantage others. And on Monday, we talked all about how we level that playing field. So now that we know what cultural capital is, let's think about how it situates, how it's seated in life. So there are generally accepted by sociologists four types of capital. So there is that cultural capital, the worth of a person's knowledge in their setting or their field based on their experiences outside. There's economic capital, as we've already discussed, financial wealth, how much money you have in the bank, or in stocks or in property, or however you keep your money. There's social capital, your social network, who you know. And then there's educational capital, your skills, your opportunities, your qualifications. And all of those are very, very tightly interlinked, to the extent that some of these things I would have called cultural. So I would actually have called educational capital cultural capital. Because for me, the education that you are in, particularly before you go to university, so particularly pre-18, that's all to do with your culture. Because in the UK, we have these catchment areas where basically you will go to the closest school to your house, or to the house where you spend most of your time, in the case of children who split their time between two households. And you don't really get much of a choice. You might have the choice to take a test and go to a grammar school, in which case you will again go to the one that is closest to your house. If you have got decent economic capital or maybe good social capital, you might go to a private school. If you can afford to do that, if your parents are best friends with the headmistress and she will give you a discount. So they are all very much interlinked, and they always have been. I was watching The Larkins yesterday. On Thursday, based on H.E. Bates's Pop Larkin books. It's the new version of Darling Buds of May. And the character Pinky Jeroboam verbalized this to a teacher. She was talking to Mrs. Chan, who is the head teacher of the village school. And Pinky says that it's not what you know that gets you far in life, it's who you know. And Mrs. Chan, the teacher, says, well, that's very sad, that's a shame. Don't you want better for your children? Is basically the insinuation. And Pinky turns around and says, no, not really, because it works for us. And I think that's the other thing to remember about capital, is that it's all about what works for you as the individual. You're going to prioritize the one that makes your life better. You're going to claim that the one that makes your life better is the one that matters. But actually it is the interplay of the four, of economic, of social, of educational, of cultural, that makes up a life, and that makes up advantage, and that makes up privilege. And that's very, very important for us to remember. So Bourdieu, the sociologist who came up with this idea of cultural capital, he defined three prominent concepts that help build into this cultural capital. So we've got habitus to start with. Your habitus is your experience and social position. So your habitus is basically what no one really controls. It's all about the outside, the outside pressures that are on you. With our children, their habitus is quite often controlled predominantly by their parents or their guardians, because they are born into the social position of their parents. They are those who are maybe adopted or fostered, do so into the social position of their adoptive family, their foster family. But of course, they have their initial life experience to begin with, and that builds into their habitus. As we get older, we do have more control over our habitus, because we control whether we go to a museum of an evening, or whether we sit and watch Netflix, or whether we sit and read George Orwell, or whether we read a comic, or whether we doom scroll, or whatever it is we might do. But for the young people that we teach, they have very little control over their habitus. Then there is the field. And your field is the space in which you live your life. If you are in London, which has theatres and restaurants and museums and Chinatown and, all sorts of cultural diversity, you're going to have a very different experience to somebody growing up in rural Gloucestershire that I did, where, you walk through my high street and there are charity shops and there are takeaways. And you compare that to a friend of mine who came to visit last week and said that his high street is, again, much smaller than my own, and has, I think, a pub and a village corner shop. Those are three very different experiences that we have just based on the space that we're in. And that's what Bourdieu meant by field. So where our children are growing up very much determines the access that they have to all sorts of cultural ideas, which in turn has an impact on their cultural capital. Then there's the doxa. The doxa is something over which none of us ever have any control. The doxa are the rules of the game. They're the rules by which we live. They're the rules that society has determined to be important. And so we have to live by those. So interestingly, when we're thinking about how Bourdieu came up with cultural capital and what he says influences it, we actually have very little control. We have zero control over the doxa. We have, as adults, control over field and habitus, but our children don't. Our children have that controlled for them. And that, of course, means that part of our job as their teachers, or as their social workers, or as people who write books for them, is to help to broaden their cultural experience so that we can help to improve their cultural capital. Because if we do that, and if we help to expose our children to a whole range of culture, the children that don't have the opportunity to do that at home, the children who don't have the privilege of doing that at home, get that privilege. And the children who do already do cultural things at home with their parents get more of that privilege. Now, there are, of course, discussions to be had about equality, about equity. That's really important. I don't have time to go into those today, but I'm not ignoring them. What I am saying is that all children have the right. They, in fact, have a human right. I put this on my display, but it is in the UN list of human rights to have access to culture. And so we should be, as teachers, making sure that we plan for and provide those opportunities for them. Sullivan, in 2000, conducted a piece of research which stated that children who achieved well read complex fiction, watch documentaries or current affairs programs or science and nature programs, attend events that are seen as high culture, so that will be theatre, will be ballet, and they have parents with higher level qualifications. Now, of course, this is, as all educational research, a generalization. As I said, I am in the process of studying for a doctorate, but I am the very first person in my family to get a degree of any kind at all. My parents have both worked since the age of 16. And so, it's not that these things are necessary for a child, for a person to achieve. This is just what he found helps. What's interesting, in my opinion, and based on a conversation that I had with a colleague of mine the other day, is that some of these are very defined. So watching specifically documentaries or current affair programs and science and nature programs, that's very defined. Whereas read complex fiction is a bit more woolly. Because I had a discussion with my colleague about what defines complex fiction. Because we were talking about manga and anime. And of course, as someone who's one of his specialisms as a generalist is in Asian media and languages, I am very much in favor of our young people watching anime and reading manga. They like it, they enjoy it, and the biggest thing that I took from the children's literature course that I did at university as part of my my English and Classics BA is that picture books, comics, are just as complex as novels, but they are complex in a different way. They are complex in that you have to learn to read the pictures. You have to learn to understand what the artist is getting at. It's not as laid out for you as it is in a novel. So in some ways, you can argue that graphic novels, comic books, picture books are more complex than narrative prose because there are multimedia elements to it that children have to learn to decipher. My colleague didn't like that idea. He is more in favor of the gradual introduction of children to George Orwell, to the classics. And I think that's important too. But as we will discuss in a couple of minutes when we talk about high and low culture, there isn't really a big difference. So I thought that was interesting. But what that means for us as teachers is we need to make sure that our students are reading. Now, in my opinion, what they read doesn't matter so long as they are reading, because it all broadens their horizons. If my year sixes are sitting in their free time and reading football magazines, that's absolutely fine by me, because they are reading. Now, I understand that not everybody has that opinion. We should be getting them to watch documentaries, to watch current affairs, to watch science and nature programs. We, if possible, should be giving the opportunity to attend high culture events, take them to the theatre, take them to the ballet, take them to the cinema to watch the ballet on the screen, if that's easier than getting them to an actual ballet. There are all sorts of ways to access high culture. We can't do anything about providing parents with higher level qualifications. But what we can do is make sure that our children understand the value, the importance, the joy of education, so that they can potentially be the parents who have higher level qualifications. Or we can teach them that actually you can be the first person in your family to go to university, and you can do very, very well. You can get your first class degrees. And we can help them to celebrate that. I think it's all about teaching them that their experiences, whatever those experiences may be, are valid. That their interests, whatever their interests may be, are valid. Because when it comes down to it, everything is culture, in my opinion.
It's time for a fresh start to language learning. Pearson EdXL's new student-centred French, German and Spanish 2024 GCSEs cater to the needs of all learners, regardless of their background, ability or reason for studying. Rooted in learned language knowledge, their assessments are transparent and accessible, allowing all students to showcase their language skills. Through inclusive and relatable content, the new Pearson EdXL MFL GCSEs build a shared cultural capital that helps students develop an understanding of and appreciation for the wider world. Find out more at go.pearson.com/MFL GCSE 24.
Okay, so there are these two main theories around how we can give our students access to culture. And the one that is important to us as educationalists is the cultural reproduction theory, which basically says that the education system is biased against the working class and it favors the dominant class culture. And there is this idea that we in school attempt to get all of our kids to be middle class, regardless of what their class background is. And again, if you think about what I've just said based on Sullivan's report, this idea that we should be getting them to watch current affairs, science programs, go to the ballet, go to university, that is all, those are all signifiers of the middle class. And it kind of ignores the actual lived relevant experiences of the working classes. Ray et al. In 2009 did a study into working class students in elite universities. And they kind of set themselves against Bourdieu. So Bourdieu is arguing that in an unfamiliar field, the habitus changes and it becomes divided against itself. What Realital found is that it's a bit more nuanced than that students begin to develop creative adaptations and multifaceted responses. So there is this idea that you can not really fake it till you make it, but kind of, that you can adapt your cultural background, that you can adapt where you have come from to fit where you are now. You can adapt your habitus to fit your current field. And that's quite interesting when we think about identity. When we think about particularly stigmatized identity. Now, a stigmatized identity is an identity that is somehow undesirable or demeaning according to one specific domain. And having that identity means that you are not fully accepted in society. Now, if you were to take a microcosm of a school, for example, then class can become a stigmatized identity. You know, if we are studying specifically working class students at, in inverted commas, elite universities, then we are suggesting that being working class there is a stigmatized identity in that field, because it's the thing that gets in the way of those students being fully accepted into the society of that university. And so they are having to control their habitus in order to make sure that they are accepted, or at least that they are not excluded. And this works in conjunction with the theory of hegemonic identity. So hegemonic identity is the identity that is so dominant that it makes other people reluctant to assert their own individual identities. It makes it difficult for people to assert their own identities. And again, we see this in all sorts of fields. You know, if we look at sexualities, for example, because the, in inverted commas, default is heterosexual, homosexual people have traditionally, historically, found it difficult to assert their own feelings of identity. If we look at gender, because stereotypical masculine and feminine, that binary, has always existed, those are the hegemonic identities, that a woman who presents as quite masculine, a man who presents as quite feminine, a transgender person, a non-binary person, might find it difficult to assert their identity or to be taken seriously because they don't fit into the hegemonic identity there. And so their identity potentially becomes stigmatized. So all of this means that our students' identities, based around their cultural capital and the culture that they're in, can make it very difficult for them to assert themselves. And this, again, is why it's important for us as educationalists to broaden our own horizons so that we can allow our students to be mindful of, to be aware of different types of culture, different types of identity, so that our students with stigmatized identity don't feel stigmatized, and so that our children who are part of the hegemonic identity also don't feel stigmatized, because they shouldn't feel left out, but also that they understand the privilege that they have by conforming to the hegemonic identity. It's also complicated and it's also nuanced. And I think it's really hard to get this right, to be honest. I think it's really hard when you get down to the nitty-gritty of what cultural capital is and what exposure to culture does and how important exposure to culture is. It's really hard to get this right. And as a single individual teacher, you don't have to do all of it. Let's take my my year 8 German class, for example. I, as their German teacher, don't need to be responsible for taking them to the ballet and letting them read manga and letting them collect football cards and taking them to a museum. I just have to be one of many teachers, and not just teachers, but one of many adults in their lives who give them all of those different experiences. And I can just do the ones that relate to my knowledge, my interests, and my subject. And as long as I am one of many teachers doing that, then my children are going to get this broad range of cultural experiences that will improve their cultural capital, that will make it easier for them to learn things, which again is my job as their teacher. The difficulty as an individual teacher comes if you are the only person doing that, if you are in a setting that doesn't prioritize cultural capital, but you as a person know that it's important, because then you are the only one. So I think what's important here is for us to all remember that we all have a part to play. And unfortunately, that's a phrase that we hear a lot in education, because we all have a part to play in everything. We all have a part to play in safeguarding. We all have a part to play in sport. We all have a part to play in RSE. We all have a part to play all the time. And there are lots of parts that we have to play. But as somebody who believes that culture and language is important, as somebody who believes that the more you know, the easier it is to learn other things, I do think that we all have a part to play in this one. And I'm perfectly willing to sit here and say that, to be a hypocrite, because I hate being told that I have a part to play in things that I'm not sure are so important. But I guess that's part of my own cultural capital, isn't it? That I'm privileged enough to sit here and to have seen the importance that culture plays. I'm privileged enough to have this space to talk to you, this platform on which to chat about cultural capital, which means that I've done the reading on it, and I'm privileged enough to have had time to do the reading, and so I can sit here and say these things. It is interesting when you start to pull your own cultural capital apart and you start to consider how your own cultural capital impacts your own identity and your own values and what you think is important. Because then you can start to realize why these experiences are also important to our students, because they help to build up this rich, complex, multifaceted personality that we all hope that we as individuals have. If we think about our diaspora children specifically, so our children who are no longer situated in their in the country of their heritage, so immigrant children or second generation children, for example, they begin to have what's called a hybrid identity when it comes to cultural capital, because those children at home have one hegemonic identity, the identity of the culture of their parents, of their homeland, of the place that they grew up. And then when they go to school, there is a second hegemonic identity, the identity of the country in which they now live. And they need to try and merge those two together into their own personal identity. And it can be very difficult for those children to do that, particularly if the two cultures are conflicting. So if, for example, you have a child who comes from a very orthodox religious household that very strictly believes that there is a gender binary and that heterosexuality is the norm, in inverted commas, for a reason, and that's what they are grown up to believe, and they then go into a school in a country that is telling them that actually gender is a spectrum and sexuality is a spectrum and these things are fluid, that can be very difficult for those children to resolve, and they will have to make a choice between the two sets of culture that they are involved in and what they believe. And I suppose, again, that's the point of cultural capital, isn't it? Is exposing our children to different points of view, to different ideas, and giving them the tools that they need to come up with their own beliefs in a very rational, logical way so that they can justify and defend what they believe. That kind of situation, that's called secondary socialization. So it's this idea that we learn lots of lessons outside of the family. So we learn things in school, in media, from our friends, from religious institutions. So that's all secondary socialization. And it can, if we're not careful, reinforce a stigmatized identity. So again, I was thinking about my colleague who was lamenting the fact that his tutor group liked to read manga instead of novels in their reading time. And my initial reaction, I was very defensive to start with, because of course I like manga, I read manga. I think there's nothing wrong with it. And so I went on the defense and I was just like, well, if that's what they like to read, then isn't it good enough that they're reading? And I stand by that. I stand by my assertion there. But then I was also thinking that actually, what are we saying to our children if we are saying to them, what you are reading, that thing that you enjoy, it's not good enough? Your comic is not as good as Jane Austen. Therefore, you are lesser if you are reading it. Playing your computer console is not as good as playing rugby. Therefore, you are lesser if you are playing on your computer. So we do have to be careful when we are teaching cultural capital, when we are trying to bridge that chasm of cultural capital, that we are not suggesting that certain culture is better than others, because that can reinforce stigmatized identities that already exist. And that, of course, is, as teachers, not what we want to be doing. So let's take a minute to think about popular culture. I love pop culture. I'm just going to kind of nail my colors to my mast here. I very much like popular culture. I think popular culture is very important because it's popular for a reason. So popular culture refers to these cultural artifacts that are produced for mass sale to ordinary people. I did read one definition that suggested that pop culture products are short-lived and have no lasting value. I actually disagree with that, because I think if you look at the work of Charles Dickens, they were pop culture in his time. They were produced for mass sale to big audiences. They were produced a chapter or two at a time, as a way of hooking people to get them to buy the next installment. You didn't buy a whole Charles Dickens book. You bought a couple of chapters, and then you waited for the next couple of chapters to come out. They were basically soap operas in Victorian times. Shakespeare, who is now lauded as one of the best English language playwrights to have ever lived, and I would agree with that, he wrote, or his intention was to write, summer popcorn munching blockbusters. He didn't intend to write these kind of high society, high culture as we see it now, masterpieces of theatre. That's why his plays are full of lewd jokes and double entendre and all sorts of things that we tend to gloss over when we teach them to children, or we pretend aren't there when we watch them on BBC Two. So I would disagree that pop culture is not intended to last. And I would disagree that pop culture is lesser than high culture, because we've seen that even in just 200 years, something that is pop culture can become considered high culture. And again, I'm looking at my bookshelves now and I'm wondering if any of the mass market paperbacks that I have, if any of the comic books that I have, will any of those be considered high culture in 100 years' time? I don't know. And I suppose that's one of the points of it. We don't know what the future is going to look like. We don't know what people are going to look back on our time and think. And so if we start judging certain types of books, certain types of films, certain types of plays as being more worthy, more cultural than others, we are casting judgments on things that we don't really understand because we don't have the benefit of hindsight yet. So for me, it's really important not to judge what a child is reading or collecting or playing, but making sure that they have a diverse range of experiences. If a child was exclusively reading comic books, then I might suggest that they pick up a novel. In the same way that if a child was exclusively reading novels, I might suggest that they pick up a comic book, because it is that diversity of experience that is important when we're talking about cultural capital. Not saying that one thing is better than something else, but that all things are relevant, all things are acceptable, and it's the range of knowledge that a child has that makes other things easier to learn. I keep coming back to that, but I think that is what underpins cultural capital here. That we need it so that our children can learn, and so they need to have a diverse range of experiences. Now, Cooley came up with this concept of the looking glass self, which is the idea that our image of ourselves is reflected back to us like a mirror in how other people see us. And so again, this is why it's important that we don't judge youth culture, that we don't make mean-spirited jokes about TikTok, because what that is doing is showing our children that their culture, what's important to them, is not respected. And if children don't feel respected, they won't respect. Children very, very clearly see respect as being a two-way street. And so, I do joke with my children about TikTok, about all social media. But I make it very clear that it's not a judgment. One of my sixth formers the other day asked me whether I was on TikTok, and I said no, because I'm not 13 years old. Which perhaps is dismissive of the genre. But at the same time, I wasn't saying that it's not important, because it is important when you're a teenager. I was just saying that it's not important when you get to my stage of life. I think it is a very fine balance there. But we need to be very careful when we are tackling culture and when we think about cultural capital, that we are not belittling things, because many children will see that as a belittlement of themselves. This then falls into Mead's research in 2001. Mead was studying a tribe in New Guinea, and she found that they had a very different interpretation of masculine and feminine characteristics to in Western societies, which led her to conclude that ideas of masculine and feminine are not based on biological differences, as we like to believe they are, as we're told they are. Oh, well, men are biologically stronger than women, and that's why they do X, Y, and Z. But actually, masculine and feminine characteristics are socially constructed. And that means that the sense of identity can be in flux, because your sense of identity, even something that you might consider as fundamental, as innate, as whether you present as masculine or feminine, depends on the culture that you're in, depends on the society in which you are living. So our individual identities change in these very, very small ways all the time. We are constantly in flux. Think about code switching, for example. Code switching is when you use different language patterns depending on who you are talking to. So right now, while I'm talking to you, my wide ranged, diverse audience, I'm using a very different type of cadence. I'm using very different language to if I am just talking to a friend of mine, which in turn will be a very different type of language to if I were texting. So that's called code switching in linguistics, and we do it all the time. And that's just one way that our identity is in flux, that our identity changes depending on the culture we find ourselves in, the situation that we find ourselves in. And again, cultural capital allows our children to make those switches because it broadens their horizons, it gives them more information, it gives them more to draw on so that they can adapt themselves to different social situations, the different situations that we hope that they will be in, because that means that they are leading positive, strong, productive lives. So ultimately, I can't believe that we are already at 27 minutes past 10. I've got 3 minutes to wrap this up. Ultimately, cultural capital is the essential knowledge and experience that a child needs to be educated. Hello, Mr. Magpie, how's your wife and family? I've now got a magpie sitting on the telephone line just outside my window. And of course, part of my cultural capital is the rhyme 1 for sorrow, 2 for joy, 3 for girl, 4 for boy. So I always like to greet a solitary magpie. But anyway, cultural capital is this knowledge, this experience that a child needs to be an educated part of society. It's the essential knowledge and experience, the range of knowledges and experiences that children need to be a success. And it's not down to one teacher to provide all cultural capital. It's down to a school to embed cultural capital as part of its provision, and for all teachers to play their part in giving these cultural experiences to their children. So as we leave today, I'm going to ask you to think about what you do in your school department to help to build cultural capital. What do you do within your own curriculum to bridge the cultural capital chasm, allow for different life experiences? And what opportunities do you offer through enrichment programs, through extracurriculars, through trips, through what's in your curriculum in order to broaden your children's cultural capital? because all of this is really important. And I think if you are starting to plan for next year, if you're starting to put together schemes of work, to put together lesson plans, think about these things. Think about the opportunities that you have for cultural capital with your children, with your classes. Oh, thank you, Tim. Tim is a long-time friend of the show who has texted in to say that it was a good one. I appreciate that. I really, really do. Thank you very much. This is my last show before I take a hiatus for the summer. So I will not be with you for breakfast for the next 4 Saturdays. I will, however, be back on Saturday, the 5th of August for our next one. Hopefully, my month away will give me some time to come up with some new interesting things to talk to you all about. I am, however, hosting one more show with Pearson in July, so please do tune in for that one. And as I've said, if you are intrigued by anything we've talked about today, please do go back and listen to last Monday's show. So that's a show from Monday, the 26th of July, 2023, which is all about cultural capital and all about how we can bridge that gap. Thank you so much. I hope you all have a wonderful summer, or a wonderful July, because I will be back in August. And like I said at the top of the show, this has been a period of reflection for me. So I want to thank all of you who listen, who contribute to this platform that I have, because I do appreciate it. I do appreciate you all being here. And I hope that every Saturday I bring you something to think about, or just something interesting to listen to while you're having coffee and a croissant in the morning. Have a great July, and I will see you all in August. Goodbye.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.